I want to welcome everyone to our third installment of our the International Luxembourgist Network's teach-in series on socialism and the world crisis. So I just want to give people a little bit of background on the ILN. We are a network that groups together. We're not the only group, but we do group together activists who are in general agreement with the ideas of Rosa Luxemburg. Luxemburg's work on democratic self-organization of the working class, the mass strike process, the functioning of capitalist accumulation, and her unwavering opposition to all forms of nationalism is, we believe, critical to not only understanding, but acting in today's world. So we're not just a talk shop, it's about applying Luxemburgism to the world. And so we do hope you will stay involved in obviously attending this event shows some interest in Luxemburgism, but we are in contact with you, and we hope you will join the network since it is open to all and become active in the work of the network. Stop that share. So let me introduce our speakers for for today's presentation, and they will go in the order that they're listed on the flyer that was sent out. And so our first speaker is going to be Deepika Maria. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Okay, great. She teaches in the Honors College at UMass Amherst. And is an active member of the Amherst chapter of the Democratic Socialist of America. So we're glad she's with us, and she's been very active in planning the entire series. Our second speaker spoke previously at the first session, I believe, right? Or yeah, the first session, and a comrade of ours, Eric Van de Venner. He has a PhD from the NYU Department of Sociology, and is the author of The Strong Dollar and the Political Economy of Financialization, very timely topic. And then the third speaker is yours truly, Jay Arena. I teach at the CUNY College of Staten Island, and I'm working on a book on the struggles over privatization to defend public schools in Newark, New Jersey, and Avron Rips is a major character in the struggle. And I'm also part of an emerging group, the mass strike tendency within our union, the PSC. And then finally, we have Eric Lerner, who's a member of the International Luxembourgist Network and author for a workers' recovery plan. So let's, no further ado, we'll turn it over to Deepika.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Jay, for inviting me. And I'm going to open my paper. And my paper got a very general title, which resembles the title of our entire series, which is What is Socialism? And I say that I have divided this presentation generally into 4 sections. The first one I call events. The second one is reality on the ground. The third is history. And the final section, which is kind of short, is looking to the future. Events. 2 events that had a deep impact on my thinking. The first one was the 2007 economic downturn in the United States. The other was Occupy Wall Street in 2011. When the economic meltdown happened in 2007, caused by irresponsible and risky dealings of financial institutions, what amazed me was the speed and dedication with which the government bailed out many of the companies that were impacted. The government fronted over $700 billion, not only to bail out banks, but also businesses like GM and Ford. And very little investigation took place of those who were culpable for causing the disaster. We saw the complete surrender of the state to capitalism. So many people lost their homes due to risky investments of their mortgage loans. The African-American middle class specifically were severely impacted as 2/3 of the homes that were foreclosed belonged to African Americans. Overall, people were left hanging with little support from the government. At that point, as a society, we could not see any alternative to the capitalist system. So I'm not talking about individuals, but I'm saying as a society. The second event is Occupy Wall Street in 2011, which was inspired by the uprisings in the Middle East, known as Arab Spring, where people in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, among other countries, began to question the logic of neoliberalism. While there was a lot of emotion, anger, frustration expressed on the streets during Occupy protests, people were functioning without a clear anchor to a specific set of ideas or frameworks being articulated by the movement. It was a situation where people organizing the protests were putting in practice, but if they're not organized under shared frameworks to fight back, the left will disappear. People as motivators of change will disappear, and the issues they raise will disappear. How could a protest without a clear anchor or theory lead to transformation of society? It can't. Without shared anchors that would take us forward, movements disappear. What I learned from Occupy is that not having a clear anchor disarms activism, for it does not know where to go. Now, coming to the section on reality, I say that reality is that socialism grows slowly. It's about people coming to it, and people come to it when there is a crisis that makes them consider alternatives. Samir Amin has pointed out, although, and I quote him, underestimated at first, socialism vanished from the horizons, from the centers of Europe into the peripheries, bringing together socialist aspirations of people in the non-Western world through liberation struggles of those people. That is to say, socialism is about creating solidarities among people. Those could be through national struggles that are revolts against imperial states. The former have now grounded their legitimacy through new theoretical understanding of alternate political and social forms. That is how socialist ideas will keep up with the times and find echoes in present-day movements through challenges calling for transformations in different conjunctions. So it doesn't have to be just, as it has happened in the past. People struggling against imperialist realities opens the door to people's movements. Recently, we saw this take place in the global south, where the peasant movement in India that went on for 15 months against farm laws that would have handed over much of the control of agriculture to agribusiness. The farmers recently won their demands, and the democratic state had to repeal its imperialist policies. I want to think about such protests in the future, where comrades from many parts of the world step in to support, join, and spread the word, so farmers or workers in any part of the world are a piece of a larger unrest against imperialism. Socialism in the 21st century is related to aspirations of people who are willing to even challenge democratically elected governments. This new structure of socialism, or maybe not so new anymore, is a fundamental condition where people are no longer relying on governments to take the lead. Because if our anchors for an alternate future remain within our current systems, we cannot hope for a liberated future from those systems. How can our movements that are looking towards socialism have an impact when they continue to be handicapped by existing democratic practices? In addition, reforms within power regimes have frequently broken their promises and often degenerated because anti-imperialist projects are a contradiction to imperial powers. I think about, when I'm talking about this, I think about the example of American democracy and white supremacy kind of, hanging in together at the same time, American democracy and slavery, kind of having a say at the same time. One of the ways to engage with capitalism is to demoralize its suffocating agendas. By demoralize, I mean defeat imperial forces through people's rejection of them. We must have armies of people demoralizing imperialist agendas that are not armies of imperialist states. Only then will socialism's work be realized. Demoralizing is an important concept because it stands for morally and politically rejecting imperialists who crush people's aspirations looking for a decent life. Even though the last 30 years have demonstrated the offensive launch of capitalism characterized by neoliberalism all over the world, this offensive, with its economic management of deregulated markets, has led to dismantling of social programs and stifling popular sentiment of people. The offensive is led by centers of imperialism and their partners. We know the ruling class will not give up its privileges. They believe in its immoral structures. The challenge before us is that we have to learn from capitalism's immoral structures and not repeat them. Our democratic awareness must make us alert to our quasi-colonial existence, and we must stay away from liberal alternatives that quickly take on imperial dimensions. Solidarity teaches us to stand with, to stand along people, promoting horizontal forms of practices. In contrast to vertical practices that I just spoke about, promoting cooperation. This should be our commitment to the people, because socialism and solidarity cannot be built on abstract ideas. They require strategies and actions for disrupting the work of capitalism. Now I come to history. Tony Kushner, in his play, Angels of America, the part 2 of the play has a character called Alexei Anti-Diluvinik, who is supposed to be the oldest Bolshevik living. He asks the question, what were Glasnost and Perestroika? In other words, what was the theory behind dissolving the Soviet Union? Even a snake, when it sheds its skin, there is another skin to replace the previous one. What was Russia's new skin after 1989? The loss of the Soviet Union has been a huge loss to intellectual life. As imperialism began to speak for and define socialist states and their projects, we basically erased a big part of our intellectual history, where Russia had opened intellectual spaces that are now controlled by capitalism. Now capitalism takes control of our imaginations. It is important that multiple forms of awakenings remain part of our social and political horizons that do not take for granted the inequalities in society. When we see people sleeping in cardboard boxes in New York City and Boston, for example, it's unbelievable. It is an abomination, especially because people are being deprived of a chance to try alternate systems that would allow us to think anew and work towards giving everyone a decent life. We need to build socialism in the United States because we cannot talk about an international solidarity movement without a strong socialist movement in the United States, one that questions capitalism in the mecca of capitalism and its impact on this society. The selling of arms, the destroying of nations, actions legitimated by imperialism need to be rigorously debated in the US through public platforms that include strong socialist voices. After 1989, all explanations for movements are stressing spontaneity to explain social uprisings. There is very little discussion of organizing that includes the role of the vanguard. Let the people do what they want seems to be the popular sentiment, reminding us that spontaneity must be organized, and spontaneity and vanguardism should be a dialectic. That does not mean the vanguard has to be in the forefront, but it should be ready to engage with the people. People cannot just rise up. Movements are not just built on pure emotion. They require slow, steady direction, tactics, strategy, and shared frameworks. These alternatives can be summed up as decadence or revolution, echoing Luxemburg's idea of socialism or barbarism. This humanist alternative, mastered and controlled by the people, is important as it brings people out of the shadows. As agents of transformation, it is important people are in control of mapping the way forward towards their emancipation. Internationalism should be a must for the success of socialist projects where the global North and the global South converge, giving birth to a new kind of universalism, as opposed to older kinds of universalisms, that were another way of talking about colonialism. The objective should be to articulate the struggles of people in the North and the South. And internationalism of the people cannot be based on vague concepts such as global solidarity, which often looks and acts like charity. We don't want socialism to turn into another slogan like fight against poverty. All these are affirmations of goodwill that don't go very far. Internationalism should be based on common interests with a common adversary that we come together to fight. Right through history, it is people's solidarity that has brought about change and progress. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about looking to the future, which is rather short. So it's not enough to keep whipping capitalism. I say we must move beyond that and teach the young theories that will help them build something different. This is where our focus should be. What should the future look like? And are the young up for the challenge? We stand with decency. We must ask the next generation what they stand for. Is their fight also against inequalities and injustices? Fighting for people's sovereignty is not a recipe that one can simply adopt to any situation and place. It is an endless process of struggle for direction and advancement through movements. People have to express the need to develop their means for social progress so that they do not get taken away from them and turn into lip service by the state. The struggle for socialism in our times is the struggle against military control by the US and its allies and putting socialism at the center of geopolitical debates. As long as this project is not addressed, all advances at the global level will remain vulnerable. Right now, the people who are attacked, I would say the most by imperialism, are the ones who are its active adversaries, pushing to put the brakes on imperialism. The projects of the poor in the North and South, for example, the example I gave earlier of the farmers in India, pushing back against national and global capitalism define our goals. These struggles have no reason to stop growing until they achieve their end. A project that affirms a common humanity and regards our common goals, such as climate challenges we face right now, are the social struggles that must bring us together against imperialism. For socialism is the future that will change the nature of power and substitute it with democratic solutions that bring a clear understanding of the problems that lie ahead of us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deepika. And our next speaker is Eric van de Venne.
Hi, can you hear me? All right, so I'll be talking about many of the same themes, the questions of what is socialism, what is the role of the class-wide program, what is the worldwide socialist program, and I'll say a little bit less about tactics because I think that's about the amount I can cover, but I hope to get to those in the QA. And I'll use some examples of the problems and the social ills of the United States in particular, because that's my greatest area of familiarity, but I'll try to make clear why those have to be addressed in an internationalist way. So with that, so what I see is that in the next 20 years or more, we will be in a period of great crisis worldwide. Unfolding environmental catastrophes, we don't know their extent or when how far they will continue. A financial instability of the major world markets based on massive debt, unprecedented levels of this, a falling rate of profit, an absence of useful investment in many of the major economies, and general stagnation. We are seeing in some countries a kind of growth without development, where we have more and more of everything and extensively building, but not in a way that improves the lives of the people who are using these things. No qualitative development, and this extensive development in the end threatens the earth. And that is what capitalism is offering us right now. Along with, of course, the possibility of major wars. We haven't seen such major wars in some time, but these very likely at some point. As well, we have the situation that what has been called in the last decade or so left-wing social democracy is at an impasse. It was attempted to bring some of these more left-wing caucuses to power in various European countries or through the Bernie Sanders movement. And this has, I would say, stagnated and has also had many of the problems of this electoral approach that have existed throughout the 20th century. So at least I would argue that the evolutionary socialist path is blocked right now, as it has been in the past. The reforms and electoral movements, of course, we welcome reforms, but their potential is limited and oftentimes deceptive. And I would say the future welfare of life on Earth depends on our success here, because it declines significantly each year that we continue in this way. The degree of environmental devastation that eventually will face us mounts year by year. So this is the context for my first question I will get to, which is, what is socialism? It's an economy and society based on the fulfillment of all human needs, rather than the satisfaction of profit, as in capitalism. It is an economy based on planning, which overcomes the scarcities of the market in order to fulfill these needs. And it organizes our work, our human activities without wage labor, eliminates wage labor and eliminates class differences. These are the ultimate goals of socialism. It is an international system of economy, not a national development of particular factories and so forth, but builds upon what progress capitalism has offered us in international connections and preserves that. It is also internationalist. Decisions are made by and for people across the world, eliminating borders and allowing people to cross them freely, not by any particular national leader, for example. Parts of this vision are sometimes termed communism, or the higher stage of socialism, something like that. Karl Marx, in his critique of the Gotha program, said he didn't make clear these stages of socialism and communism in the way that is sometimes presented, but he said there would be a very prolonged transition period, and that it would be extremely difficult for us to cross this threshold and make the changes necessary to actually have a socialist society. He called this the period, the dictatorship of the proletariat, or we could call it the period of the working class in power. And this happens as a result of a revolution and expropriation of the capitalists. Likely we will discuss the first steps towards this, not the actual revolution, for example, a bit later on. Okay, some versions may call this period socialism, where there's a continuing existence of labor, even with wages. But whatever it is, it has to actually be a transition. It has to be moving towards socialism, not to state capitalism, not to a ramified welfare state, not to a bureaucratized, nationalized economy. Although some of those things will happen on the way. So I want to address the needs and ills that a socialist transition will have to overcome, again, particularly with reference to the US, because we need to understand the tendencies and transformations in which the working class will have to move towards socialism in this century. All right, so I'll speak next to what will be the economic foundation for this transition, and where would the US fit in? So in 2021, and in the past 2 years, we've seen COVID basically unleashing the breakdown of the satisfaction of human needs in advanced capitalist societies and throughout the world, including the need for life, the ability for people to survive. We're right now racked supposedly by the idea of inflation. And this, I think, illustrates the international character of the economy. Inflation actually is not so much a matter of workers receiving higher wages right now, but as has been shown by various articles, it's a result of markups by capitalists. Capitalists are simply charging more to try to capture profits that they feel they were entitled to or lost over the past decades, when there's been a deflation, a fall in prices often caused by competition from cheaper producers. And capitalists are trying to capture that by raising prices as much as they think they can get away with, and doing it all collectively and at the same time. But another cause of this inflation has been asset inflation, the run-up of the prices of stocks, financial assets, and especially housing and real estate, which has led to rent inflation, which increases everyone's expenses, especially workers, much more often than particular commodities being inflated. and the breakdown of the supply chain during the COVID crisis. So the US has been shown not to produce basic commodities that it requires, and their prices accelerate greatly when the supply chain begins to break down, as it has. These things show crucially how the transition to socialism must be based on an international economy. We don't want to rebuild, industrial capacity, duplicative industrial capacity in the US to replace everything that would come from the supply chain and have an autarkic economy of some sort. And we can't afford that environmentally at all. As well, commodities, and especially imported commodities, although they're a very large share of the commodities we have, they form a shrinking share of the working class budget. So we are not in the US, in fact, although the US massively exploits labor in other countries, living on the work of 200 million or so low-paid workers abroad. Most of the work that's done in the US is in other sectors, service sectors and so forth, and that is what US workers are spending their time on, quite needlessly and wastefully, as I will argue. US capitalism largely wastes the lives of its production on these internal unproductive pursuits and results in these morbid symptoms of our social life, of despair, political derangement, violence, and so forth. We see a cultural impoverishment of much of the United States, and I'm sure in other countries as well, where rural areas and urban areas are each made distorted and incomplete, environments in which to live, each of which have inadequate standards of living in very different ways. In urban areas, a shortage of space, a compression and constant stress. In rural areas, a bit more space, a bit easier to get around with cars and so forth, but a lack of sort of the cultural facilities that and the diversity of human pursuits that we used to have, or which we are more accustomed to in cities. And I think the segmentation and sectionalization of our society based on education levels and political attitudes is quite damaging consequences. That one of the things that socialism must overcome is to bridge these divides. So we need a social reconstruction of society to be able to continue toward a higher level of socialist transition. First, of course, we need to address our reliance on carbon and mitigate climate change. We need to replace carbon in electricity generation. We need to remove the need for gasoline for commuting and for shipping of goods. We need public transport and improved rail systems. Second, in the US, we'll have to address the housing shortage, partly through new construction of housing, so people aren't so horribly crammed together and must pay so much for rent, but also redistribution of the spaces that we have, redistribution of the large and capitalist properties, both residential and commercial. Third, we need to address the wasteful use of our time in advanced capitalist labor markets and tasks that only have uses because of the specific social arrangements of capitalism. This has been called socially necessary, unproductive labor, work needed for and specific to the capitalist system as a social organization, but not materially necessary, doesn't increase our quality of life. Examples include the police, security, military, much of what lawyers do, insurance, banking, advertising, retail, etc. I actually want to work on a method to measure exactly what portion of the labor that goes on in a country like the US is devoted to these things, because in socialism, we won't have them, or they'll be pretty close to unrecognizable. There'll be certain kinds of white collar jobs involved in planning the economy, but not the ones that capitalism has created or has trained people to do. Meanwhile, capitalists are trying to reduce all of these kinds of all these forms of work with technology, computer applications that replace secretarial work, surveillance. Amazon, the company, eliminates perhaps millions of retail jobs, which is in a way efficient and almost desirable to the future society, that we don't need people sitting around, but we certainly don't want people working in Amazon warehouses in the way that that is organized. But capitalists then create layers of management to capture more profits and force workers into new kinds of unproductive work. So now we have the medical management industry and proliferation of corporate bureaucracy. It doesn't seem that capitalism will ever really reduce the amount of sort of necessary but useless labor that it has come to demand. Whole professions of specialists devote their time to applying for grants, justifying expenditures, putting lines on their resumes, and other things that interfere with education, and they interfere with the advancement of science. So I would argue that a part of socialism is that workers need to gain control over their work processes so that they can choose how to use time efficiently and produce things well and in good quality. Teachers, for example, need not to be bound to the bureaucratic curricula and the testing requirements and so forth, which both reduce the quality of education and make their working day very onerous. What we need is a comprehensive plan to eliminate some of these kinds of work, replace them with more useful ones, and eliminate whole sectors of the economy that are wasteful and oppressive. The lockdowns of the last 2 years and the phenomenon of necessary workers have shown just how little of the labor in the US is really crucial from a certain perspective. The middle class work from home phenomenon, largely made up of what would be classified as unproductive workers in Marxist value theory, show to a great extent things that simply could be done in a more efficient way. And people making their own coffee and meals and so forth would form a better form of organization. So I believe we may be discussing a demand for jobs for all, and I certainly support that. But these need to be new kinds of jobs. And more directly, what we've seen is that people are choosing to work less and even without retaining their wages, but they should have a 35-hour week, indeed a 32-hour week, a 30-hour week, and a 20-hour week at the same wages. That is the direction that capitalism is going, that is the direction our production systems are going because they don't need all that labor. It is not the direction that capitalism is going. It is impeding this development. In the past year, we've seen what's called the Great Resignation. People, especially young people, see that there's no purpose or growth to the kinds of careers that are available to them. There may be a higher standard of living possible with less work, even with lower income. And they see no larger task or destination for our society's work. Capitalism is seen to be in stagnation and approaching a dead end, except perhaps for tech companies and millionaires, often seen as a decadent society. And this leads to, both among capitalists and in other classes, nihilism and sociopathic selfishness. And much of politics then become premised on this nihilism and this selfishness. By the way, my view is that the economic struggle of American workers for higher wages in unions is, of course, very, very positive, but it has shown limits, and its direction towards a social democratic party has not led to revolutionary politics and progress towards socialism in quite a while. Not to say we should not support these things, but we have to be realistic that other ways of engaging in social struggle may be more promising. So my hope is that addressing these kinds of inequalities and providing time for personal growth will mitigate the psychological and political morbid symptoms of the present age. And beyond treating the ills of unproductive dead-end capitalism, what tasks should be set for a transition to socialism? Well, first, I think internationalism is key. We should decide these directions by an international plan, and the associated producers of the socialist future, that is the working class around the world, should be involved and should have a say, including what the US economy does. Controlling what productive decisions are made should be useful to the rest of the world because the needs of the US have been relatively more satisfied. There is, of course, no democratic process, much less a rational socialist planning system to determine what the rest of the world's workers may wish for US socialists to focus on. However, we have some clear indications, basic demands that are obvious and have to be satisfied. We have to reduce and mitigate carbon and its effects, including through clean energy and perhaps public transport, rail infrastructure, and so forth. We need to use our productive capacity to improve standards of living worldwide, and we have to accommodate more people in the US, especially in the course of climate change, with a higher standard of living, and that means open borders. The same would be said for Europe and Japan. We need to reconstruct healthcare worldwide, and I'm saying that we need a system of socialist reconstruction. Reconstruction of our social systems should be our view. Through provision, healthcare to be reconstructed, through provision of medications and technology, and building safe water and housing situations throughout the world. We need to reconstruct US agriculture, which has a disproportionate share of arable land in the world, to use less land, but more efficiently, eliminating some of the more wasteful things we have, like cattle ranching and growing corn to feed pigs, but producing higher quality products to feed more people, perhaps requiring more labor even, and at higher wages. And we need to reconstruct our advanced industry to some extent to supply tools that may be needed for development everywhere else, and diverting production from weapons, excessive aerospace production, luxury uses, and other things that the relatively advanced manufacturers that still are in the US tend to produce. I'm getting close to the end if that's a question. Part of how I would frame this is as a matter of reparations, and not even as a moral imperative, although that might be justified, but reparations not only to Black population, formerly enslaved people, but victims of imperialism around the world, and those who have been exploited for all kinds of reasons. Not simply to redistribute capitalist property and to give financial assets or money, but to give meaningful control and a role in decisions of our socialist planning of the future, so that we can have and make use of the full capacity of humanity and the full capacity of workers. It's a matter of interest that we should revise our system of decision-making in this way. And this is the condition for everyone's ability to have a socialist future in which we can engage in more rewarding and self-developing activities than mundane work, and also set tasks beyond what capitalism has been able to accomplish, something in order to give a direction to humanity or a direction to individuals, so that they feel more integrated. So I'll close with a quote from, I think, the manifesto: "The free development of each is the condition for the free development of all." And that is an argument of solidarity. It is an altruistic argument, but it is not only an altruistic argument. The solidarity says that it must be that everyone is able to develop in order for each of us to develop. Because societies in poverty cannot preserve the environment as needs to happen. Because the existence of exploitation anywhere means there will be powerful enemies to social progress, and there will be powerful enemies to socialism. So we must remove that exploitation to make progress. And finally, the positive basis or interpretation of this quote is that we should set social tasks higher than what we are presently capable of, not only to free our time to pursue the arts and things, but to do things socially on a large scale that we would like to imagine are possible. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And I'll call on myself now. We'll then have Eric Lerner, and then we're going to open up to our audience. So I'm going to be using a PowerPoint here. Okay, let me go to full screen. Okay, can everyone see the screen? Full screen?
Hi.
Yeah, okay. So below are some of the questions that inform this session on what is socialism that I'll be addressing in the presentation on the class-wide program, the mass strike process, independent socialist electoral politics, the type of organization that we need. So I'm going to address these questions first by an analysis of some of Luxemburg's writings and key arguments. And then I'm going to look at their application by ILN activists such as myself over the last decade in various struggles in the New York, New Jersey area. And then I'm going to conclude on how these Luxemburgist ideas could be applied to the terrain that I'm in now at CUNY in the struggle of other education workers. So these are works that are drawn from the Marxist archive, Marxist net archive, and I encourage others to look at these. But a really important one is a short piece by Luxemburg in 1898 on opportunism and the art of possible. And there she's making two key points. One is the need for socialists to come together on a common program, not a whole laundry list, but a coherent alternative to get us from the capitalist misery to socialism. And this has to be democratically decided upon, right? Secondly, she argues that with this program, we have to uncompromisingly fight for it, right? And that links, these struggles link the broader program to the various terrains of struggle that we're in. One way of looking at it is various outrages, various struggles, but we come back with one answer, with one program. And she argues that's the way we actually even make any gains. So I just want to read one quote here in the metaphor that she uses that I think is really powerful for driving home her message. She says, "But if we begin to chase after what is possible according to the principles of opportunism, unconcerned with our own principles and by means of statesmanlike or stateswomanlike barter, then we will soon find ourselves in the same situation as the hunter, who has not only failed to stay the deer to win any kind of demand, but has also lost his gun, the movement in the process." And maybe for today's translation, we can phrase it as, we only make gains when we fight for what we want, rather than what has been termed permissible by the Democrats and their satellite organizations. So program, fighting for what we want, and uncompromisingly, that's how we make gains. The other article I'm drawing from is Social Democracy and Parliamentarism, going in chronological order, right after the last century. And she is responding to some French Marxists who are rejecting socialists engaging in the electoral field, that instead they see true revolutionism as the purely economic struggle of the worker. And she argues, no, that we need to engage in the electoral field, but with candidates that we have democratically decided upon and that are committed to carrying out the program that the movement has agreed on. And so when they're running and when they get in office, they are democratically beholden to carry out that agenda. And furthermore, they coordinate that fight in Parliament, in the legislative bodies, with the struggle in the streets, with the struggle in the factories. That is where they can get, that's where the only place that they get any real leverage. So let me just want to read this quote for the bottom paragraph. She argues, and this is again in the early 20th century, and she's referring to Germany here. The danger to universal suffrage. Yeah, well, early 20th century Germany, but relevant to 21st century America. The danger to universal suffrage will be lessened to the degree that we can make the ruling classes clearly aware that the real power of social democracy, socialism, by no means rest on the influence of the deputies in the Reichstag or the Congress and state legislature, but lies outside in the people themselves, in the streets, and that if the need arise, social democracy is able to and willing to mobilize the people directly for the protection of their political rights. And I think this really starkly contrasts with the DSA members in Congress and the critique that's gone on that, yes, they're members, but there's no commitment, which has been outrageously seen with Congressman Bowen from New York meeting with, the Zionist regime, even though the DSA is on record of supporting BDS, that there's no connection, one, between the program and what they do. And furthermore, there's no connection between the fights in the Congress on the congressional floor and mobilizing in the streets, which we do need, including around universal suffrage, with the attacks that we're facing. So really important words on the electoral field. And then finally, turning to her classic work, The Mass Strike, the title of our journal. And she argues, this was 1906, after a study of the first Russian Revolution. She called it the phenomenal form of the proletarian struggle in the revolution. If we just look at the US, the major class battles where gains have been won, these were all really mass strike processes. The Great Railroad Strike of '77 to fight for the 8-hour day, 1886. The 1934 to 36 mass strike wave, which really organized, out of that came the mass unionization of industrial workers. Now, she emphasizes the mass strike is distinct from a general strike that we still see in Western Europe, in Latin America, where trade union leaders will call a strike, call out the unions in response for a 1 day or 2 day strike to some austerity measure or some other measure by the capitalist government. In contrast, she argues the mass strike cannot be called by the trade union leaders, the socialist leaders. It comes from below, the struggle from below. And then these leaders are usually if they do call a strike, they're doing it kicking and screaming. The other feature of the mass strike, it combines political and economic demands, and it often arises from major changes in the organization of work and where there's an intense attack on living standards, which we are experiencing today, including through the rise in inflation. Now, she also critiques this idea that the mass strike is a product of a sufficient level of organization. In contrast, she argues, the organization arises as a product of the struggle. And one fine example is the 34 to 36 strike, which organized massively industrial workers through the mass strike process, is how they're unionized over that 2-year period. Now, socialist, as much as we would like, we cannot call forth the mass strike. But what she does argue, once it emerges, we can intervene in the process to radicalize and push forward the demands. And furthermore, although again, we can't announce it, call it into being, we can, in a pre-mass strike period, help kind of prepare the soil for that to emerge by convincing workers of their common interests in a program that unites political and economic demands. So in that pre-mass strike period, and that we fight uncompromisingly for those demands in these delegated democratic organizational forms. And again, that can help prepare the soil for the mass strike to emerge. Okay. So now, why is this not moving? Okay. So now I want to look at, over the last decade, the attempts by ILN activists, including myself, to apply these Luxemburgist ideas to various struggles in the New York, New Jersey area. So one was the Demands Working Group, which also both Erics were involved in along with other activists. And this emerges in the aftermath of the 2007, 2008 global economic crisis and the emergent fightbacks around the world. We saw in Spain, the taking of the squares in Greece, the overthrow of dictatorial regimes in Tunisia and Egypt, the broader Arab Spring, its reverberation into the heart of empire in the United States and Wisconsin, the attack on labor rights, and then its emergence in the Occupy Wall Street movement that breaks out in the fall of 2011. And again, we couldn't call that forward, although Eric Lerner did appear at many of these mass strike processes in Greece and in Egypt at the time. But we can't call it forward. But in the midst of that, we can work to push forward the demands. And that informed our formation of the Demands Working Group of Occupy Wall Street, right? It was open, you could form any kind of working group you wanted. So we called a meeting of the Demands Working Group. A number of people came, and we worked on, well, what are some demands that we could all agree on to present to the broader movement? And what you have below is basically the outline. Equal rights for all, so kind of political and economic demands were brought together. Free public services and jobs for all through taxing the rich and ending the war machine. And also we talked about democratic control of finance, but I don't know if we actually agreed on that. And so we called another meeting. I think it was several meetings, and we had a kind of an assembly in Tompkins Square Park where about 75 people attended, and they voted for this. But it then went to the General Assembly of Occupy Wall Street, the Manhattan outpost of the movement. And this had emerged, this General Assembly was classic mass strike process, new democratic organs emerged, but its operation was actually very anti-democratic in the way in which it required like a 90% vote to pass anything. And there were all these rituals that made it very difficult to get any kind of agreement on the demands. There were some obstacles. Again, we attempted to use Luxembourgism, but not very successful in advancing the demands of the movement. And that helped to crush that movement, because that advancing those demands were critical for bringing in larger layers of the working class. And when it didn't do that, it opened themselves to repression from the state. Another attempt was the People's Assembly in Newark, New Jersey. After the crisis, community group, People's Organization for Progress, launched a year-long picket for a national jobs program. And the ILN, working with People's Organization for Progress, the Newark Education Workers Reform Caucus, and the Teachers Union in the city, and a number of other groups came together to organize a popular assembly. And we worked to prepare for the conference with a set of demands that would be presented and debated upon. And they were basically the three demands enunciated below: equal rights for all, including the formerly incarcerated, undocumented immigrants, jobs and equal rights, jobs and free public services for all. And we made it a point that this took on any kind of oppression that would block the actual universality of these programs. So that was a key part of that demand. And we had, it was over about 150 activists, variety of activists, different organizations in New Jersey, particularly northern New Jersey, attended. We had a introductory speech by a student activist that was involved in the Quebec student strike. And we did, after a lot of debate, discussion, some amendments, we came to agreement on these broad demands. Now the weakness, so that was a strength, advancing the demands, right? But the weakness was any kind of action to actually win them. And a key stumbling block was on the electoral field, agreeing to run independent candidates, independent of the Democrats, running on this program and beholden to the movement behind that. We couldn't, because a lot of these groups still are tied one way or another to the Democrats, and an unwillingness to kind of get out of their single issue silos and actually work together on these demands. So many outrages, one response. It was a difficulty of getting that. Likewise, the CUNY Popular Assembly came out of a struggle in the mid-2010s after we had been 6 years, this is at CUNY, City University of New York, 6 years without a contract. And there was kind of a movement from below, and we did hold an assembly, but it was really difficult coming to agreement on a coherent program, and less so on any united actions to carry that out. Now, the campaign to close the ICE concentration camps did result in more victories. After Trump's election, there was an attempt to bring together the various immigrant rights group, and it was under the umbrella of the Resist the Deportation Machine. And so we, the ILN activists and Jobs and Equal Rights for All, we argued if we were serious about resisting the deportation machine, particularly in New Jersey, that meant closing the ICE concentration camps that the local Democrats who run the various counties in northern New Jersey, deep blue New Jersey, run for ICE. Now, some of the groups more in the orbit of the Democrats, the NGOs, were not in agreement on this. They were not. But the RDM as a group committed to ending these, and they did agree, although they didn't raise the broad demand, we did agree to it. But the major focus was on an uncompromising fight around ending the ICE concentration camps in 3 large urban counties in northern New Jersey. And I'm delightful to say that in 2021, all of them have closed. The Democrat-run camps, and this has been part of a national campaign, but we were successful in doing that. And the fact the remaining one is a private one, and the private landlord is desperately trying to get out of the contract with ICE after formally defending it. And so that's been a real victory. Again, an example of a level of Luxembourg, uncompromisingly fighting for what we want. And we eventually brought around some of these groups that had initially not been for closing the camps for various reasons. And then finally, another arm of this movement was running myself, yours truly, as a candidate against in Essex County and against the county executive that was overseeing this ICE concentration camp. Now, we brought that up in the RDM, the resistant deportation machine, and there was not support for that. Some of it was some of these syndicalist ideas, others still tied to the Democrats, were unwilling to support an independent campaign based on our program. But a few of us in the Jobs for Equal Rights for All campaign did nominate me, and we agreed on this program. And so I used the electoral campaign to introduce the fight to close ICE, to shut down the camps, and our broader program. And we did help. It was another avenue to advance the campaign. We got about 4% in the areas that we actually campaigned heavily, and it was nearly double digits. And so we think that if we could, as a movement, as the socialist movement, come to agreement on running our candidates, we could be getting into double digits, which would create a real threat from the Democrats, which basically is a one-party state in places like New Jersey and other major cities. Okay, what were some of the more general obstacles that we see to agreeing on a common platform, a common program, and carrying out a struggle to win them? I mean, one has been over the last, since the counter revolution of capital since the 70s, there's been this huge redistribution of wealth, and these billionaires have created their foundations and have dramatically expanded kind of the NGO apparatus that fuel, particularly the liberal ones who dominate the foundation world. They fuel kind of the single issue silo organizing, to use the word of Les Leopold, one of our presenters in our last session, that are tied to various identities. And so they're very hostile to any kind of coherent program, much less so in running their own independent candidates, independent of the Democrats. We also see kind of this anti-statism, we could call it a left wing of neoliberalism, that does not distinguish between the cooperative and repressive arms of the state. And we did see that especially expressed in the leadership. There was a leadership of OWS, although they didn't acknowledge that was deeply hostile to making any kind of demands on the state, and their use of this conservative anti-democratic decision-making. All of these kind of created serious obstacles to agreeing on common sets of demands and carrying out struggle around them. And then, of course, we have the long-term problem of the union bureaucracy that is accommodated to the capitalist offensive. It has been hostile to mounting any kind of class-wide fights, most dramatically expressed in the PATCO strike, but we've seen many other examples. And then I do have to include this, even among self-identified leftists and socialists, a hostility to class-wide demands under an anti-racist cover, that they're not effective in combating oppression. So how does this play out? What are the potentials at my terrain of struggle at CUNY as a member, as an education worker, and a member of the PSC union, of carrying out, mounting a class-wide demand and a struggle to win them? Now, we do not, Eric talked about a lot about logistic workers and the strengths that they have, but we're not port workers. We're not Amazon workers. We don't have that power. But I would argue we have another form of positional power, and that's a result of the organic ties that education workers, including CUNY education workers, have with working class students and their families. In CUNY, in the center, the belly of the beast, New York City, 250,000 full-time students, 30,000 faculty, the overwhelming majority super exploited adjuncts, and 45,000 workers overall, all in the center of global capitalism. Now, our progressive leadership likes to talk about, of our union, that our working conditions are our students' learning conditions. And that is true. But what the pandemic has further underscored is that the living conditions of our students, their housing conditions or lack thereof, 10% of our students are homeless. The healthcare conditions, the health conditions, the type of living conditions they have, the run-ins with the police, those conditions reverberate back into the classroom. Right. So what happens outside the classroom comes in their lives, comes into our classroom. But what we've also underscored is that what happens in the classroom when we go out on strike or we have to go virtual, that reverberates into the broader production process. And that's why we have the capitalists screaming, despite the public health threat, to reopen the schools by any means necessary so they can reopen the economy, i.e. reopen the extraction of surplus value. So that's a really powerful connection that we have. Now, the only way that we can get what we need at CUNY, like ending the two-tier divide, rebuilding the collapsing infrastructure, is to take back the trillions that the billionaires have stolen. And in fact, on any progress and any terrain, including around immigrant rights, we've got to take back that wealth. So that demand, that big demand, informs the strategy that we need to undertake. To do that, to take back that wealth, we have to make our fight at CUNY the fight of our students and the entire working class. So how do we activate that potential power, that organic relationship we have, that positional power? We need to hold popular assemblies of education workers and students to agree on a common set of demands, a program. And this is much more than what we've heard a lot about with some progressive unions, bargaining for the common good. We cannot be constrained by the limits on the scope of bargaining that this current straitjacket of collective bargaining in New York and other public sector unions are limited to. We should use the current collective bargaining to demonstrate that our fight is the fight of the entire working class, that we go with, and Eric Van de Vetter talked about kind of the limits of unions, and we need a new form of working class organization, right, that links the workers with the working class recipients of those services, right? And then we go together with those demands to sit down with CUNY, which will be barred, but that will underscore that our fight is for the entire working class. But on top of that, we need to form, because this will only be won by a massive strike, is that we form democratically run strike committees at each campus, selected at popular assemblies to prepare for a strike to win these demands. Call for this for the whole union. Now, in the aftermath, I'm going to be wrapping up very shortly here. In the aftermath of the pandemic, CUNY has been facing a decades-long attack. In the aftermath of the pandemic, the rulers, as they were giving billions, as Eric Lerner has explained, billions to the billionaires in New York, they were taking more out of our hide. And so our measly 2% raise was withheld. 3,000 adjuncts were thrown into the street, lost their health insurance in the midst of the greatest pandemic in a century. And the union was basically powerless, doing nothing. And so a group of us at our chapter came together to introduce a fight back resolution. And this is some of the features of it. And it connected a class-wide program with immediate demands at CUNY. And so first and foremost, as we said, to make any progress, the rich have to pay. And so we called for a wealth tax, which they can do at the level of New York State, a 5% wealth tax on those with over 2 million of wealth. And that would be used for free public service and jobs for all, right? And as we said, we need those issues of housing and healthcare and transportation and clean energy. Those are issues that reverberate back into our classroom. Those are our issues. And then there were specific CUNY demands, and then it called for building the kind of struggle, the strike committees at our chapter level across the union, and calling for other unions to debate these demands and come to agreement and to build strike committees to win them. And we also called on our union to call the statewide popular assembly of workers and students to debate these demands and to come to an agreement and to carry out a plan of struggle to actually win them. Okay. Now, there was an attempt. As we know, these were small union meetings. We did get 30% of those in agreement to vote for it, which was significant. But that's not what's gonna take to launch this kind of strike. But we did raise the demand. There was clear opposition, hostility from our chapter leadership, as well as the overall union, but also, interestingly, from many reform groupings within the PSC union. The dissidents were hostile to raising class-wide demands that break strictures on collective bargaining. Although they give lip service to it, they put out this line that it will simply emerge spontaneously if we launch the strike. To launch an effective strike, we need the students with us in the broader working class. And the way to guarantee that is to articulate concretely that our struggle is their struggle as well by raising these demands. And finally, if we look in the mass strike, Luxemburg makes this similar argument. The tactics of the socialists are decided according to their resoluteness and acuteness, and that they never fall below the level demanded by the actual relations of forces, but rather rise above it. That is the most important task of the directing body in a period of mass strike. Well, the actual relation of forces, what is going on in capitalism? As the late Ellen Miskin Woods argued, a central strength of capitalist rule has been the apparent, as opposed to other class societies, separation of the political and economic. The crisis with the $120 billion a month, and that's really a conservative figure, being poured into the coffers of the corporations, that has created what Eric Lerner has called state finance capitalism, has unmasked, has made transparent the naked role of the capitalist state. Our demands and forms of struggle need to reflect that. And that was an attempt with the demands that we raised. And then finally, where do we go? At this point, we've got a lot of work with our mass strike tendency. But one attempt that we're doing is through this struggle, we did come into contact with others that have similar ideas, and we're going to be beginning as one step in the future struggles that lie ahead is a study group to look at Jane McAlevey, who's got a lot of circulation in DSA, and she raises some important demands and important critiques of the union bureaucracy, but we see some limits as well, but we need to engage McAlevey, Kim Moody's critique, Joe Burns's work on class struggle unions, and then of course, Luxemburg and the mass strike. So I'll end here and hand it over to my comrade, Eric Lerner.
Okay, thanks, Jay. Let me see. We do share screen. And so we've got everything on the screen, right?
Yes.
And we can go forward and backward, right?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah. So maybe I can be a little briefer. Some of my points have been covered by the other speakers in terms of the question we're addressing, what is socialism? Again, we start out that socialism is the only way out of humanity's present crisis, the only alternative to a new dark age of pandemics, fascism, and eventual depopulation. I repeat the little graph that I showed in the first teach-in, showing that this present stage of development comes out of a 40-year decline in the rate of growth of the capitalist economy, turning now into an actual contraction. as measured either by the rate of mortality decline, which has now became a rate of mortality increase, or the rate of use of energy, which has now become a decrease in the use of energy. By any measure, we are turning into a contraction, a retreat of global society under the leadership of capitalism. So what will a socialist program do? We need both emergency and medium-term measures against the pandemic, and these measures require, especially in the medium term, fast transfers of wealth and control from the capitalists. The emergency measures, many of which can be taken under capitalist rule, taking control of the government-funded vaccine production, which, by the way, is what should have been done under American law, and to distribute and vaccinate the entire human population, mobilizing defense industry capacity, which I'll come back to in a second, to increase the production of vaccines and medicines. We need centralized exchange of best practices in fighting COVID and other diseases. We need a wartime mobilization of the physical sciences, as in World War II, for broad-based physical means of fighting bacteria and viruses. For example, we already know that UVC light, which is harmless to human beings, it's stopped even by the tears on our eyeballs, is deadly to almost all microbes. A huge program to make that light affordable and generally available could be a broad-based step against all pandemics. We need eminent domain to seize control of empty hotels to serve as high-quality quarantines. As I say, many of these measures could be taken immediately. They would hurt capitalist income, but could be done under present capitalist rule. But to get out of the period of growing pandemics, to get out of the conditions that lead to pandemics, much more broad-based steps must be taken. We have to complete the process of global urbanization, which is now just about half done, and provide a decent life for all. As other speakers have mentioned, we need a global system for free housing, for the infrastructure that goes with it, to concentrate population away from wildlife that can spread new diseases. We need reforestation, and as Eric van der Venter meant, the concentration of agriculture on smaller areas, as has been done already to a certain extent in Europe. We need a vast expansion of free public health throughout the entire world. And this is possible only with a vast expansion of free education to provide the manpower, the people power necessary to staff this great expansion that we're talking about. The only way to get this vast expansion is to mobilize fully the defense industry in the United States, which is the largest defense industry, and in other countries. That is our reserve industrial power with the highest technology industry, which could rapidly overcome the shortages that we are seeing and instead provide hundreds of millions of jobs for people to carry out this program. But this program has to be financed by the destruction of capital. The only source of several $1 trillion a year is to take back the capitalist income and wealth that they have stolen. This also, as other speakers have mentioned, is the cure to inflation, is popping the bubble of the not only real estate, but of the stock market, which leads to inflation. So obviously these steps, taxation of capitalist wealth, and especially the stopping of the entire $120 billion a month for the United States and many hundreds of billions of dollars in the rest of the world, theft of working class incomes to feed directly the holdings of corporate America. Simply stopping this program and selling off immediately the trillions of dollars of corporate holdings would immediately lead to the mass bankruptcy of the entire financial system. And under present laws, require the social ownership and control of all finance. Since the financial institutions own outright, legally, 70% of the top thousands of corporations, that would immediately lead to the socialization, the public ownership of 75% of the economy. What is interesting, I should say, is that much of this program is agreed to by wide parts of the population, and even in the liberal Democrats was quite part of the program of Bernie Sanders, except for the need for taking this money away from the capitalists and selling off, stopping this subsidization. This is something that we as socialists have to popularize among the working class population. Now, the second point is going to be less familiar to probably even this group. Socialism means a fusion-powered economy. What we are talking about requires tripling energy consumption, and that's impossible with fossil fuels. Right now, we're using 14 billion tons of fossil fuels per year, leading to 7 million deaths from fossil fuel air pollution alone, completely excluding effects on the climate. $5 trillion in energy costs, which also are a major driver in inflation, would make impossible the tripling of energy consumption with the present energy sources. And we can get into this more in the question and answer, but solar and wind are far too expensive to use as base energy. We need energy that is denser, in other words, more energy per unit mass, cheaper, cleaner, and safer than fossil fuels. And that the only alternative is fusion energy. Now, what is fusion energy? Fusion energy is the energy that powers the sun, the stars. It's the power that drives the universe. Fusion fuels are 1 million times the energy density of oil. 1 gram of fusion fuel has the energy content of 1 ton of fossil fuel. I am a fusion energy researcher, and I run a small company together with some people who are already present here in Middlesex, New Jersey. We are talking about using a fusion fuel from hydrogen boron, which is immensely abundant. It can be derived from seawater, and producing decentralized, cheap, compact fusion generators. Helium gas is the only byproduct. There is no radioactive waste. And if developed, we are still in the course of developing these devices, our device would be 10 times cheaper than any existing energy source. Fusion energy would make possible decentralized 5 megawatt generators, which could also make possible the total recycling of all waste products using already existing commercialized plasma torch technology, which can reduce any waste back to its useful elements. You can learn a lot more about all this at our company websites, which is cited here. Now, people ask, why don't we have fusion now? People who know a little bit about fusion know people have been working on it for half a century. The main answer is governments have wrongly concentrated on a single hugely costly device called the tokamak. And right now they're building such a tokamak in France. And if you can see this tiny little guy over here, you'll see the gigantic scale of this machine compared with our machine that fits in a small room. We need instead a crash program that funds all possible routes to fusion. And that demand has to become part of a socialist program. Now, thirdly, and again, I'll be brief because other people have referred to it, socialism means democratic, delegated control of society and economy at all levels. Why do we need democracy, not just state ownership? First of all, without democracy, the reestablishment of capitalism is inevitable, as is shown by the historical examples of the Soviet Union and China. When decision makers are separated from workers, that is the basis of class society, and capitalism inevitably reemerges. Second of all, democracy is essential for running an advanced industrial society. Eric van der Venter gave examples of this. The fact is, bureaucratic states can manage the transition from an agricultural to an industrial society. They cannot manage once an industrial society has emerged. It is far too complex for a centralized dictatorial bureaucracy. Finally, democratic movements alone can defeat fascism. Only by giving individuals the real ability to participate in the decisions that a movement makes can we show what real freedom is and educate people against the false promises of a fascist movement. So finally, I want to just briefly say, is China a counterexample? Because here we have an undemocratic capitalist country that seems to be doing fine against the coronavirus and has grown rapidly. Well, the basic fact is the Chinese model is unsustainable because it is based on vast underinvestment in the next generation. The combination of the housing shortage and the one-child policy means that there is going to be a 1% annual decline in the working age population for the next 20 years, and a 2% decline in the childbearing women population. And we know that's because all of these people have already been born. Many aspects of the Chinese economy, for example, the auto industry, have already passed into a stage of decline. The Chinese population itself is in the process of peaking because of an extremely sharp decline in the birth rate, which started well before the pandemic. In fact, pandemic statistics are not included in this chart. So the rate of growth of the population, which used to be quite large, is now approaching or probably has reached zero, and the Chinese population has probably started to contract. This method of running society is not the fastest route of development. Here is a graph showing the number of years that separates life expectancy in China, the blue line, from life expectancy in Japan, which still has the longest life expectancy in the world. And you'll see over the 40-year period of capitalist development in China under dictatorial regimes, the gap between the Chinese and Japanese life expectancy has decreased by only about a year and a half. In South Korea, a capitalist state with an extremely vibrant and militant labor movement, which has introduced elements of working class democracy into that capitalist state, the gap between the life expectancy, which is the orange line, has declined rapidly, and the gap is almost closed, even though South Korea in 1980 was at the same level of development as China. What does delegated democracy really mean? There's a long discussion, but in brief, the Paris Commune was the first example. The Soviets during the Russian Revolution, strike committees and mass strikes worldwide during the 20th and 21st century. It means that delegates are elected only for specific meetings at higher levels, that they report back continuously to lower assemblies, that they receive mandates on how to vote on certain issues from those lower assemblies. In the 20th and 21st century, geographically organized like citywide strike committees and workplace committees both came into existence during mass strikes and worked together. These temporary organizations arising out of mass strikes must become continuously existing organizations, the basis of a socialist movement initially, and eventually the basis of a government. For this sort of society to work, there is a necessity, as Eric mentioned, for a vast reduction in the work week, which is possible at present levels of productivity to allow time for governance, merging the role of workers and decision makers. We saw in the impact of the shutdowns how workers, when allowed time to think, drew different conclusions about their own power, about their own futures. This has to be part of day-to-day existence, and that means a vast reduction in the work week. Democracy obviously can only be democracy for all. As Jay mentioned, that means a fight for equal rights for all, especially, as we see with the present Supreme Court, to fight against those attacks on equal rights under the cover of imposing religious beliefs. Only a growing mass strike movement can defend the rights of immigrants, of women, and of other scapegoated groups. We cannot rely on the courts, on the government. As Jay says, we have to rely on movements that can become the government. So to summarize, socialism is a survival program to transfer resources from capitalists to the entire world population, to solve the economic threats that we face, which are the basis of the deadly pandemic threats we face, and to complete the job of global urbanization. Socialism must involve a rapid transition from fossil fuel to fusion energy-based economy. And socialism must be delegated democratic control of society at all levels, with equal rights for all within the movement. This is the only way to defeat fascism and to transform the working class itself, to become a school for the knowledge that the working class needs to run society. As Marx said, this revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only, in a revolution, and means in a mass strike process, succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages, which we see so much today, and become fitted to found society anew. Thank you very much, and let's let the discussion begin.
Okay, so, we've usually organized this where we ask people to keep their comment or question to about 2 minutes. And then we could take about 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll throw it back to the panelists. We have Peter Ranis, good to see Peter. Chapman. We are kind of a small gathering. Maybe people could introduce themselves briefly. We could do that to begin with. Chapman.
Yeah, I'm Shapon Adnan. I'm at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. I'm a professorial research associate.
Oh, okay. Peter?
I'm emeritus political science from CUNY and active in the same union as Jay, PSC.
Great. Yeah, Nancy? Nancy, did you just want to introduce yourself briefly, or
Muted.
Nancy share? No, okay. Len? Okay, I guess we're
Hi, there you go. I got the right button finally.
okay.
So I taught at Stony Brook, Brooklyn College, LIU, and I taught in sociology, and I spent actually 3 years in Capitol Hill. And on my bar mitzvah, a long time ago, my cousin, who was like an uncle, started writing some equations on a black car with a lot of dust and was explaining fusion to me. And he ended with this comment, which I think is sort of appropriate to what we've been talking about, which is that we will either have fusion war or fusion power, because, you know, our modern bombs are fusion bombs.
Okay.
Anyway, so I take that as a kind of clarion call. And thank you guys for your work. Okay.
Okay, Shirley? You're muted, Shirley.
There you go.
Gotcha. My name is Shirley Kessler, and I'm an educational researcher, retired from National Louis University with a specialism in early childhood curriculum. And I've been interested in socialism for a very long time and became aware of this forum, and so I joined in to learn what I could about socialism.
Great.
And
Where
I
do you
have
live?
Pardon me?
Where do you live?
Oh, we live in Madison, Wisconsin.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you were on the mass strike map. Great. Well, hopefully you stay in touch with us.
I certainly will.
Okay. Avron, our comrade from the Newark Education Workers.
Yes, I'm Avram Rips, and I am in the Newark Education Workers, Newark Public Schools, involved in Luxembourg Network and other things in terms of Newark activism and New Jersey, and pleased to meet everybody.
Okay, great. Yeah, Day out in California.
Yeah, hi, I'm just a nobody, so yeah, you can go on.
Nobody's a nobody.
Very modest. Jim, or excuse me, Jan Gibson. Is Jan out there? No, I guess not.
Jan Gibson, I'm a retired education worker living in California.
Oh, where in California?
San Luis Obispo.
Oh, and how did you find out about the teaching?
Friends who were involved. I actually participated or listened to the last, the first segment of the teaching that you did.
Okay, well, if you have a question, it'd be great as another fellow education worker. Well, we'll go around the horn, but it'd be great to hear from you. Herb, I know you spoke a little bit earlier, but do you want to say anything more?
That's Eric's spot.
Yeah, how about Aliana Wilkie?
Hi, I am Ali, or Aliana. I am a Democratic Socialist of America co-chair of my local chapter on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. I'm also a starting graduate student of social work at Boston University. Yeah, I was passed along the information for the registration for our New England District Coordinator for National DSA. So they pass along any relevant info.
Are you in the young DSA, or was that the YDSA, or just the regular chapter?
Cape Cod is quite a ways from Boston. I don't know if Boston University has a YDSA.
Okay.
I just live on Cape Cod.
I
And
was just curious because my duty was to send out invitations to all the Y DSAs, and then someone, Eric, I think I got the other DSA. So we're glad you're with us. And I thought maybe, you know, we did talk about DSA and their representatives in Congress. I thought maybe you might have some thoughts on that. Maggie?
Hi, I'm Maggie Spade Aguilar. I'm also like Allie with the Cape Cod DSA.
Okay.
I found out about it through Allie. And I was curious because I did my undergrad studies at UMass Amherst, and I had Deepika Maria for International Short Stories course.
Okay.
I recognize her way back in the day. I'm definitely not a young DSA. I work in affordable housing. I've worked at just on poverty issues and living wages. I worked at Economic Policy Institute for a while.
Okay.
And I was just curious to see this session. So
Yeah, and Deepka just had to step out briefly, but she'll be back at 4 o'clock.
okay. She won't remember me by any means.
Tony?
Hi, I'm a retired professor here in New York, live in Queens, taught at St. John's University for about 32 years.
Oh.
And just happy to listen to the discussion.
Great. So you, I'm at Staten Island. They have a campus there, but you were at the Queens campus of St. John's.
Well, short answer is yes. Short answer is yes. But early in my career there, back in the mid-late 80s, I spent some time on the Staten Island campus as well.
Oh, okay. And what did you teach?
History of thought, economic history, and run-of-the-mill bourgeois micro and macro courses.
All right. Great. And then I think that's Ivy Karamitsos.
Mm-hmm.
No, the next person, the box next to you. It's like Hollywood Squares.
Hi
here.
there. I'm sorry. I just installed this app, so no picture. I'm a chief information officer for a research company that's trying to get fusion generators made within 10 years so that we can have cheap heating season and cheap transportation and no pollution and so on.
And where are you logging in from?
Right now, I'm in Eastern Europe, former Yugoslavia or Serbia right now.
Oh, wow. Great. Great. That's nice. So we've got a varied group, some Northeasterners, but we got other parts of the globe represented as well. So yeah, I wanted to throw, did anyone have a question for any of our panelists? Yeah, Peter, go ahead. And then Shirley. Okay.
Yeah, I have several questions for different people, but
okay.
Let me just raise it in general, and people can respond if they want. The problem with Occupy Wall Street, I think Deepika mentioned this. I thought at the time it was a great idea in 2011, but obviously I think she made this point. It was all horizontalism and no concrete continuity. And my view at that time is that worker cooperatives, the occupation of factories, particularly factories that are going default, would be a moment to occupy these factories to preserve employment and to preserve work. And that's one of my points. The other is, many of you have spoken about, worker solidarity. And I'm thinking of what Napoleon said, when China wakes, the world will tremble. And I think only Lerner spoke about the role of China as a bureaucratic system. And I wonder why there isn't more discussion of the potential revolutionary condition of the Chinese working class. I mean, they represent what, 40% of the population of the world, and ignoring the Chinese working class doesn't make any sense to me at all. And as Marx says, the working class has to begin dealing with its own bourgeoisie. And I think eventually the Chinese working class will wake up, and when they do, things will really change. The other thing I have is a little difference with Jay. I know I'm in the minority. I am a DSC member. I'm not an activist. I pay my dues and I support them. So in the Bowman case, I really supported them not expelling Bowman, because in the United States, we have a single member district political system. And we know what's happened to third parties, the Green Party, Nader, and then Jill Stein. They really destroyed what could have been a Gore presidency and a Clinton presidency. Now, I know none of us are in love with Clinton, but compare Clinton to what that asshole has done in the last 4 years, turned cultural battles into the center of our political system. So I think Bowman had to go to Israel. I didn't like it, but I understand he's got a Jewish constituency. If he loses, we have a progressive loss in Congress. So you can call that a liberal perspective. On my part, I don't think it is. To change things in a two-party system, you've got to hang on with the lesser evil. Take a look at Germany, multi-party system. We now have the Greens in the government. Foreign minister is a Green. So multi-party systems are different from two-party systems, and it can be treated in a different way. How do we get a multi-party system in this country? Impossible to understand.
All right, thank Peter. A lot in there. Good political science professor with some strong, sharp questions. Shirley, you had a question?
Yes. As a curriculum theorist, one of my main interests is deciding on what should be taught, why, and by whom should make these decisions. And I wonder what the relevance of socialism is to education in the early years. Can anyone suggest what knowledge is of most worth that should be transmitted or experienced by children in the early years?
Thank you. That was a good one. Do we have anyone else? There was two good questions.
Could I?
Here's a colleague of mine, friend,
Sure.
Gilbert Spillett, who has a question or a comment.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm just to introduce myself. I'm a retired Lutheran pastor, and I have some cutting edge ideas about where religion should be today in the election process. But in my last parish, one of my members was Frank Seidler, who some of you may recall he was the last socialist mayor of Milwaukee.
Oh, wow.
And I think he ran on a presidential ticket once too. But anyway, brilliant man. And he convinced me that socialism was the way to go. He called it utopian socialism, which I think is a phrase must be used. But anyway, the question I have is, in the last presidency, we saw how quickly a huge percentage of the population could stop caring about other people and became very self-centered. And it strikes me from a theological point of view that the need for socialism to really function well would be required that we care for people, that we care about the neighbor, that we have this sense of caring for others, and that without it, I don't know. I think we need a kind of a moral change of our focus, and unfortunately, most of Christianity has cared about their own brand, and so there isn't a caring for the world. You care about people who think like me, or who believe the things I believe, and yet, as I understand Jesus as a teacher, his primary thing was to care for others. So how do you get there?
Okay, that's great. So let's go back to the panelists. Eric, well, Topeka is going to be joining us shortly, but one was directed to Eric. I'll have a response a little bit later on China. I don't know if you wanted to weigh in. Eric Van Ven.
Well, we in the International Luxembourgist Network, and we don't want to pretend we're something we're not. This is an organization of essentially 100 people scattered over the world. But we have started to develop contact with activists in China. Obviously, China is going through a period of severe political repression in which organizers, even those who are completely explicitly Marxist, such as people read about a student group that was repressed, I think about 18 months or 2 years ago, are at risk of going to prison. So the repression is a big problem, but as the crisis develops and the Chinese leadership becomes less and less able to deliver a increasing standard of living, we know that repression alone is not going to prevent the growth of a working class movement. There are strikes occurring all the time, all over China. They are kept localized by the repression. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that in the development of a global socialist movement, China, as well as our country, the United States, is going to be absolutely central. But we have to work around the repression that exists. So do you want to go question by question, Jay? Or should I answer the other question as well?
Yeah, why don't you just go to all of them that you've felt.
Okay, yeah. So I did want to reply to the last question about what you could call the other epidemic, the epidemic of selfishness that seems so shocking over the past 18 months. And this is in part a product of the atomization of society, the collapse of social institutions, where people could feel that their existence, their social existence, which is what people really care about even more than their physical existence, was connected to other people. And a socialist movement must establish on a higher basis social institutions where people can get together on an ongoing basis. I owe my existence here on Earth to the socialist organizations that were established in the 1930s. My parents met on the bus home from the famous Camp Unity, which was a Communist Party youth camp. And it was those sorts of institutions that allowed the Communist Party and the Socialist Party to grow into mass parties during the course of the 1930s, and which allowed the political development of the United States in the 1930s to look so different than the political development, for example, of Germany. during the same period. So absolutely, we have to work on developing these institutions, summer camps, weekly social meetings, using the internet, using virtual meetings to develop the organizations that must recreate the society that capitalism is in the process of atomizing and tearing apart.
Eric, you want to go?
Sure. Let me just pick up on that. Many of the things Eric just said, I would have also answered. So I think that's a very good statement. In the past, so as Eric spoke about his parents, for example, the early 20th century with the Socialist and the Communist Party movements, there were often, a wide range of social interactions that brought people together, which have, there's sociology studies on this, but many of those have been lost even from sort of capitalist society in America. I also think there's, and I'm sure in other countries, I think there's also a phenomenon recently of, and it's hard to put this succinctly, what Eric called atomization. People are separated, of course, and there's sort of social technologies for deciding how people will relate to one another and to, disconnect them and reassemble them in the interests of capitalist ideology and capitalist politics. And those seem to be enormously destructive, on top of which everyone has to spend 40 hours or more working by obligation and doesn't have much time to develop other interests and other kinds of other potentials. And I think those things contribute. And, in as much as possible, socialism would obviously try to mitigate those things. But as well, in the meantime, we have to kind of replace the things that capitalism takes from us socially. I'll speak a bit to the Occupy Wall Street question from Peter. Just a brief point sort of is that after we were involved in these meetings, of course, the movement sort of sputtered to a halt and people went off in different directions. Some of the original organizers found other ways to get notoriety in the media and so forth. And so we're still aware of what they've said and think. And some of them have basically admitted that there was a secret leadership, which is what we said at the time. And therefore, there was a governing ideology. There was a position of more or less a party that controlled much of the Occupy Wall Street process. And it was this version of so-called anarchism that did not want to have demands and wanted to resist a broad working class movement. You could probably say wanted to resist any kind of class movement for Occupied Wall Street. And I certainly think that was a dead end. Jay brought up the demands working group meeting presentation before the General Assembly of Occupied Wall Street, where we presented the demands that we would like the movement in general to adopt. And I think the threshold was actually 75% that would have to approve of it, of whatever people happen to show up. And we got about 70%. So supermajority was not enough to do anything. But there were other, I won't get into it, but there were other flaws of that form of organization that even if we had adopted it, I'm not sure how far it would have gone. That was a couple months after the labor protest march to support, or that was probably the greatest potential to get labor interested in the potential of demands at that point in time. And of course, what you said about China, it has the largest working class that has ever been assembled in human history. And I think basically that speaks for itself. And Eric made points that I would echo. Shirley, you raised this question about curriculum, and I think that's to some extent a question we can't answer. And I think there's a lot of people who should be able to answer it or should be working on answering it. I think teachers are a prime example of a group of workers who can learn techniques and can experiment and can be given greater freedom and can do a lot more for students than school administrators or especially politicians have allowed them to do or they've been able to do. So I'm sure there's a range of perspectives, and I think the way we should see, working people in a future society is that they should be investigators, scientists. They should have freedom to develop things, and there should, that basically there should be a great flourishing and welcoming of more work on whatever curriculum and learning we can learn about. I would also just point out that it seems like recently there's a effort, which is sort of a matter of workers' control, to pit parents against teachers and to, I don't have to go into the rather silly specifics, but to sort of engage in fear-mongering and scapegoating to get parents to raise demands about the curriculum, which have even more, or probably have more threats to teachers and are designed probably to threaten and weaken teachers. Anyway, we can all follow that as it unfolds. Let's see. I'll just leave it there. I think there was one other point, but maybe I'll bring it up next time.
Okay. So I'll respond to a few. We have Shapan. We'll come back to you for the second round very shortly. So Peter, with regard to horizontalism, that was kind of the someone needs to be muted or something. Okay. So yeah, the horizontalism has been the term used to kind of describe OWS and some of the other post-2008 movements that emerged in Spain. But that was the image, and as Eric kind of alluded to, it contrasted to how they actually operated. And so when we went to the General Assembly of Occupy Wall Street after the Demands Working Group had agreed on these demands, there were all these rituals. It took several meetings, several General Assembly meetings before it could even come up for a vote. And whether it was 75% or 90%, I can't remember on what it needed to be approved. It was still, it made the US Senate look like a paragon of democracy compared to how they operated. But there were all these obstacles. There could be concerns, questions. There was just a variety of, filibustering that they could carry out to block any kind of action being taken. And on top of that, as Eric alluded to, although it was supposed to be, the leaderless group, we did find when we actually formed the group and were about to bring the demands, we were deplatformed. So this was before deplatform was a thing. We were victims of that by the leadership so they didn't live up to horizontalism. That's what we would like to see, a real democratic organization using delegated democracy, as Eric outlined, but that was not the case on how they actually operated. Now, with regard to the perennial inter-movement, inter-class struggle about the Democrats, the reality is the Democratic Party, since the right-wing turn of the late 70s, the whole attack begins under Jimmy Carter, and he's been kind of sanctified of late, but Reaganism begins under Carter 2 years before the Hollywood, washed up Hollywood actor comes in. And then Reagan, and then of course, Clinton deepened the attacks on the gains from the 1930s and 1960s. Obama continued that, right? I'm writing on the charterization of schools in Newark, New Jersey. And that was kind of the intensification of the neoliberal agenda after the crisis. Obama was at the cutting edge, and a large part of the Democratic Party. So they have been partners in this counter revolution over the last several decades. Now we have been told there's an attempt, the Bernie, the Sanderistas, we've seen with the Squad and other DSAs who are telling us that they can transform the Democratic Party. There are theorists that talk about the dirty break and a variety of theories of telling us on how the Democratic Party can be formed. But what we're seeing without any Democratic control, they don't change the Democrats change them. Bernie Sanders, I mean, his base, his Democratic base with a small d wanted him to run independently. And what did he do? He started lecturing them like children. You don't understand. You have to be responsible. What Luxemburg would call opportunism. We've got to throw overboard our principles and be realistic. And we saw what that happened. We got us Trump. And now we're seeing with the Democrats, that they go in with some promises and they betray their base, demoralizes them, and that opens the door. It's a very serious threat with Trump and company returning in 2024 because they betray their base, right? That we can see that with AOC, be it realistic with Bowman. There's a platform, but that doesn't matter because they have the Democrats are not an empty box, right? It's not just this entity that you can take over, the party line that you can use. No, you have, it's a powerful disciplining operation. And the only way, but we're going to make some progress, and we could see that in a small way in New Jersey, in deep blue New Jersey. We fought for what we wanted, not what the Democrats told us was possible. And we have some real wins. And it's strengthened the movement. That's what we have to do at a national level and an international level. So, I mean, I assume my brothers here could provide, and Deepka, if she comes back, could provide other more powerful critiques on the Democrats, but they're not the answer. And to getting back to the perennial of Gore, I mean, if there's so many ways the Democrats repressed the vote, right? I mean, if Bernie Sanders had run as an independent, the party of non-voters is the biggest party in the United States. But because they don't, and who are disproportionately working class, but because the Democrats and Republicans both suppress working class issues, they keep that electorate on the sidelines. That's why they don't participate. So I don't know if anyone else has any questions. Well, let's go back to the second round. So we have Shapan. You want to go?
I have a couple of questions. One for Jay Arena. It's about what you said about mass strikes. Now, I'm not sure whether I've understood you rightly. It's possible that I've not. But let me pose the problem. I think, as far as I recall, you said the mass strikes cannot be called by trade unions and labor leaders, but by the masses from below. That mass strikes are not the product of planned organization. You also said, but one can prepare the ground by convincing workers that their interest lies in mass strikes, and that some kind of a dialectical process was involved. I wonder if you could clarify that, because there is an apparent contradiction there. Oh, so before I go, I did have one question for Deepika. I might as well say that now, because I won't perhaps stay as long as until she returns. She talked about the Indian farmers and their recent victory against the Indian state. And that is certainly true, given the nature of the kind of chauvinistic and neo-fascist Indian state and its role in supporting corporate interests. But it is perhaps uncritical to see this as a victory, as an unmixed victory, because the farmers who were on strike with their tractors and so on were also the rich peasant class of India, the people who are the exploiters in the countryside. And I think while glorifying that victory, that aspect also needs to be borne in mind. So that was my comment on Deepika's statement. Thank you.
Well, I hope you're able to stay around until Deepika comes back. She should be back shortly. Okay, Avron?
Yes, I was just going to respond to Shirley Kessler that she was talking initially about early childhood. I sent you an email because I don't know if I have time to my email to actually elaborate on early childhood, but just as elementary and early childhood are entering a very repressive period, which has been for the past 20 plus years, where the education has all been directed in an assembly line approach, the banking method, as Briere said. There's a number of lots of research on how to organize, even research in England out of what's called subversive education, where teachers organize in order to basically, when they are they're not able to organize in the union particularly, but they start to take over eventually the schools, which I think is the answer. And the other answer is there are several curricula, which I can send you, that are basically origins in Marxist orientation, Vygotsky, that you can use in early childhood, even though I'm an early childhood.
Thank you.
But I underground to certain things. So if you look at my email, I can see in more detail.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Avron, for addressing that. I was just thinking of you when Shirley brought up the whole issue of curriculum. Len? Len Mel?
All right, sorry, I had to unmute myself. I think a lot of very important things have been brought up, and a lot of very beautiful actions people have taken. But I'm partly concerned, I think, about the unity of the issues and of what's going on. So one of the first things that occurs to me is that we have the threat of major war breaking out. And somehow we've never mentioned that here, and we've never mentioned, how we would go about organizing for an anti-war movement against that, and what kind of viewpoints we would involve in that, and how it would relate to general organizing for economic issues. So that's one thing. And then secondly, I personally think a lot of left organizing has gotten weak because we don't stress enough the optimistic part of socialism. I know, Eric, we have the issue of fusion, but so I think that we need to increase both the sense of the danger of this moment. We talk about imperialism, and the prediction of major, the contradiction now being in war in the major capitalist powers. And that war, of course, would be ever more devastating than anything we've seen before. And secondly, in part, balancing that, how we see tremendous new rise-ups opening as infusion. And so in a way, we start to handle both sides of what's going on and then elaborate. Anyway, that's my thought of how to proceed, punch into this.
Okay. So Deepika is back. Shapan, could you repeat your question for Deepika?
Yes, okay. My question, Deepika, was that it is true that the victory of the Indian farmers against the Modi government was undoubtedly a major victory for resistance to what is basically a Hindutva-led neo-fascist state. However, I wonder if you have a more nuanced view, which would take account of the fact that the farmers with tractors who were blocking the roads and so on are also the ruling class of the Indian countryside, and in that sense, a class that exploits Indian workers in a class sense, but also in a caste sense, perhaps the scheduled caste, the Dalit groups and so on. So I wonder if you would like to kind of clarify whether your position is more nuanced.
A lot of the farmers were coming from Haryana and Punjab, which for everybody, you know, those are the districts or states closest to New Delhi, just to explain, you know. And so from Punjab, they were actually of a different religion. They were Sardars. So, you know, the whole caste thing doesn't apply in the same way. A lot of the farmers coming from Haryana, which is a state right next to New Delhi, a lot of the farmers there are Jats. So Jat is in the caste system, I don't know, is it number 3? They're not Dalits, I know that. So I'm presuming if they're somewhere, you know, between number 3 and 4, the Jats, right? So those are the farmers who showed up in Delhi. But as probably, you know, you may be aware of, there were these farmers' marches in many other states in India. There were farmers' marches in Maharashtra. There were farmers' marches in the South. And the fact, if you're saying that these were, you know, farmers of upper caste, I'm not very clear about that, because Jats would not be upper caste at all. And, you know, and Sikh farmers are totally different. So I don't think that there is, you know, the caste element that those who could show up in Delhi, you know, belonged to the upper caste. I think this was surprisingly, and of course, you know, some journalists in India have also commented and hoping that this solidarity actually should stay and they should not be divided from here on, because probably, I don't think this is the end of the matter. They are going to bring up other ways of trying to, you know, make sure that this farming area of India turns into part of agribusiness.
Can I just say that your point that the Jats are not upper caste doesn't really address my question, because the Jats don't have to be the uppermost caste like Brahmins and so on, but they are the ruling class of that countryside in terms
Haryana,
of land ownership and control of local government institutions and so on.
Yeah.
So I feel that you, while some of your comments on religion and caste are, I take those points, I think you're not addressing the class question. So irrespective of whether they're Jats or whether they're Sikhs, but the fact that you have a ruling class of the countryside, people who are the standard exploiters of agrarian workers, including migrant workers and the sort of people that Ian Bremer talks about, footloose labor, subject to casual things. I wonder if you would like to take those issues into account.
Actually, I am not clear about that who actually showed up in Delhi, as far as whether the Jats who showed up, there were the Jats who had big farms, or these were actually workers who had smaller farms. I don't think that they were the Dalit workers who would have the ability to show up to Delhi. So I think it's also about access, that who could actually make that journey. Because when you're talking about Indian farmers, you're talking about a really poor community. So how many of them could actually make that journey? So I would say that hopefully that this change that has happened, it will definitely impact farmers who owned land, although not the kind of agribusiness that they want to turn it into, but probably it'll have its impact right through for all farmers. Now, is there discrimination and exploitation happening within the farming farming community? I'm sure it's happening. Of course it's happening.
Yeah, Shapan, thanks for your sharp questions. I would say I'm not an expert on the Indian case, but clearly Modi, and obviously we need a class analysis of the farmers and their, I guess we could call them kulaks, they're employing wage labor as well. But clearly for the class forces that Modi represented, the agribusiness interests, they clearly saw that as a defeat. I mean, Modi did, but it's well taken. Now, with regard to the mass strike and the process and how it's called, I would encourage you to check out our webpage, luxembourg.net, and our journal, Mass Strike. And our comrade Eric Lerner has some very good historical analyses of the 1934 mass strike process in the United States, as well as France in 1968. But clearly in those cases, it followed the Luxembourg analysis and process that it was not the Central Labor Council in Minneapolis or San Francisco or Toledo, or let alone the union bureaucrats in France that called the strike. It was socialist, very left-wing forces of various sort of Trotskyists, the Mutzdyites, the Communist Party that worked out, emphasized the common interest of all workers, formed organization, carried out action. And in the case of Toledo, it was actually the union local, the organization that had thrown in the hat. And it was a class-wide organization, the unemployed organization, that came in and continued the strike, that carried the day. So even the local organization, the local union, was not up to the task. There were these new organizations from below that emerged that led to these general strikes emerging. So it clearly was not this top-down process. And if we look at, the missing piece in Madison was, they were trying to appeal to the Madison Central Labor Council. And I think we have someone from Madison here. They are never going to do anything. It would have taken some action from section of workers to move, and then to call in broader layers of the working class. And then finally, the Madison Central Labor Council, kicking and screaming after the fact, might have put their seal of approval in order to better contain the process. But it's not going to come from the top. And certainly the PSC and Peter Rannis's and myself's union, they will never, these people work overtime to prevent us from even striking, just at the enterprise level, at the university level. They they enforce the anti-strike restrictions. And that's the presentation that I provided, how we might be able to get around that. Going through and winning the union leadership to this is a dead end. It's going to have to be a bottom-up process, building new organization that unites us with our working class students with those common demands, and starting that process. And that might, force the tops to take some kind of action.
I think this.
And then finally, Shirley, I cannot speak to curriculum. Avram is more of an expert on that, but I can tell you this, that we know the best way to improve education for kids, especially for working poor kids, is reducing the student-teacher ratio and dealing with poverty. And that takes money to do that, right? And that would be really key. And the program that we're calling for would be about that at the university level and K through 12. And that would include also, as Eric has brought up, reducing the work week, right? That's another way.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
Thank you.
And then we'll go to Deepka, because Deepka wanted to respond to something too, but go ahead.
Okay. one of the comments, I'm not sure who from, but free development of each individual must be free development of all. And I really like that particular statement, and I see its application to education. That's one point. Another point is you don't have to be an expert on education or curriculum theory to have ideas about what you want your local school to teach.
Right.
It's not dependent on individuals. It's based in values of what is good and what should be. And the worldview of all of you seems to be socialism. Socialism is a good thing. And therefore, as citizens, not experts, but as ordinary citizens, I would hope you would have ideas as to what school should look like in order to advance the socialist ideal.
I think part of the problem that I see at my university is that if students are never taught, to look at poverty, look at war, look at all these, elements in a critical way, they have no sense of it. So they're going to go through this entire process, get, their degrees and go into the work and turn into some kind of technocrat of one kind or the other. And that's really what we are churning. So there's a part of me that doesn't quite blame students, because they're not being introduced. But when you introduce that material in your class and you make it seem to them that this is important, the least I can say that happens is they at least listen to you. I can't promise you, I can't say how many of them are convinced. How do I know? Especially if you only introduce it in one class or two classes, say in 4 years. It's not really going to have an impact. So, I mean, I really do blame so much of this on education and what is being introduced in the class.
Good.
And then I don't know what to say. Is it my colleagues that they don't want to talk about this stuff? I shouldn't say that. Please don't record that, But really, that's the next question, that we are all given these opportunities to teach classes. I come out of the English department, somebody comes out of sociology, humanities and social sciences. There is so much opportunity to touch upon these topics. They don't. So, I mean, there's only that much you can blame the student, because then you can say, what do your parents introduce you to? What literature do they read? I mean, that's just an example. I remember my father, my father actually had part of his education in Russia. That's how we heard about, communism and socialism in my house. And he finished his master's in India, and then he went to Russia for 2 years of training. And then he came back, and so he learned the Russian language and all of that. And we knew, how well, what the difference between Russian embassy and all these other embassies from the first world. Russian embassy, whatever activities they had, you guys, everything was free. And you go to the French embassy and you go to the British embassy, and they have their libraries and all, and for everything they're going to charge money. I mean, this is the first big difference. Now, it's not like, all of us were waiting for freebies, but what I'm trying to say is they're making it available. That material should be available to everybody. And all of that, of course, it was in translation, because in India, not that many people, know Russian unless you take the trouble to read it or learn it, So I don't know where the problem starts. Okay, some people are not introduced in families. Okay, let's let go of that. Some people are just not introduced in their college system. Then you get the society we are getting now. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the same thing is happening in India. Humanities and social sciences, nobody wants to, really, pay attention to them. Nobody wants to get degrees. No university wants to expand those departments. So that's one thing. So then you kind of, just are offering a few courses, and it's not an expansion. It's not like you have lots of different material, encouraging students to think through different lens. It's just not happening. I mean, it's really sad, and it really makes me very afraid for what's going to happen in another 25 years.
Sorry about that.
Okay. Eric, you had Eric.
I'll try and be very brief. I know we have other questions, but I mean, I think the most important change in K through 12 education is the introduction, and this doesn't have to be by teachers who are active socialists, the introduction of a historical perspective in all subjects. I mean, the way science is taught, my subject, is atrocious in the United States. And kids in the United States fall far behind kids even in other developed countries. And one of the ways of making science interesting is to teach it as the history of science. Because even at a superficial level, if you teach it as the history of science, you get into the history of society, because of course scientific discoveries have both been have had a huge impact on society, and society has had a huge impact on scientific ideas. We all know the whole Aristotle, Ptolemy versus Kepler, Copernicus sort of thing. So, introducing historical perspective at an earlier stage, something kids are very interested in. My daughter is teaching art at an elementary school level in LA. And she found students who were very young were very interested in getting some introduction to art history. And then, of course, she got pushback from the administration, which she's upset about. But, I think that, the ideology we're talking about, the people who found it didn't call it Marxism. And Marx said, if there's one thing I'm not, it's a Marxist. They called it historical materialism. And I think the introduction of history in all aspects of education is maybe the shortest route, in addition to, of course, the reduction in class size. You cannot teach much to a class of 30 students, period, at the elementary level. That's the most important change that I think needs to be introduced into the curriculum.
Thank you.
Eric, I'll just tell you another thing. When I was a young person and my textbooks, we had so many readings, which dealt with people in poverty in different, parts of aspects of life. And it was never presented to us that that was a problem. Not that, poverty, but there was decency, there were good human beings, and these stories were spun around maybe a farmer's life or somebody who's a shoemaker. Do you see what I'm saying? So there was all this that happened. So even though growing up middle class, you were aware of class differences, but there isn't this sense that, poverty is meant to be hated. Poor people are just, kind of just not doing what they should be doing. So there's a different way of understanding, even if people had less. And I think that some of that is also missing.
Okay, so, I see Shirley and Peter had a question, but I just want to make sure anyone that has not spoken had a chance to speak. And Eric, you want to respond as well. But is anyone that has not asked a question? Okay, Day has her hand up, she hasn't spoken. So Eric Vandevetter, do you want to respond to something?
Yeah, sorry, there's a lot to get to there. I was so fascinated by the discussion of the farmers movement in India. I used to live in Delhi, but I'll leave that because I don't have much to add. I'll very briefly touch on the issue of education. The Marxists and the utopian socialists and the Marxist socialists had a lot of ideas about how to organize education. Some of them wanted to sort of extend childhood outside of classrooms and involve children in crafts, in useful labor, in growing things and so forth. Vygotsky was the famous Soviet Marxist education theorist. I'm sure there were others. And is any of that, the right way to go? I don't know. It has to be investigated. I'm not sure who's done it recently, but it seems like there certainly are ideas. I don't know who best to investigate those. let me just briefly go on to there were a couple issues connected to social movements that came up, the mass strike, and the Democrats. I have a lot of arguments against working through the Democrats, but I'll try to contain those for the most part in the interest of time and not being too polemical. Let me just sort of offer an example on the point of the mass strike. We have to look back a while for a conventional mass strike, but in a sense, the Black Lives Matter mobilizations, the Justice for George Floyd movement of last year had characteristics of a mass strike. In that it was, of course, people were already not working for many reasons. Often they were getting unemployment or something like that. But it was a somewhat spontaneous, very large social movement. And I think it really put the pressure on capitalists. And I can't prove this point, but I think that kind of threat of a working class that was not contained by the Democratic Party had a very large impact on the fact that we got extended unemployment and that we got, for some of us, and we got benefits checks. There are other explanations for those things. And the fact that it does not continue this year is also a partial explanation for why it does not continue. Of course, it does continue at a certain level, but on the same scale, it's an explanation for why the capitalists do not make concessions now. Of course, none of these concessions are sufficient, but that is how capitalists make the decision to make concessions when they do make concessions. I would make a point about the leadership, and this has come up a couple times, in the idea of whether there's an organizing ideology or a direction to social movements. And it also pertains to the point that was brought up about wars and the anti-war movement, which is that sort of short of mass strikes, a mass civil disobedience movement or even a movement of mass marches can have an effect on national politics and what capitalists do. But most of the examples we've seen have been under the hegemony, I would say, of the Democratic Party. That is to say that Democratic politicians get involved, NGO leaders who are connected to Democrats, labor union leaders, or rather bureaucrats who are connected to Democrats. And this is not an accidental thing. This is a process of the Democratic Party and of the ecosystem of social movements in the United States, and I'm sure in other countries, where co-optation is an important outcome of these. And that's why the anti-war movement completely sputtered out after Obama was elected. That's why the immigrants' rights movement was very much curtailed after the election of Obama. I'm sure no one's unaware of many of these points, but the effect of, circumstances are very dire. It's crucial that things go better than they have in the past. The way that important advances for socialism have happened in the past is when socialists, independent of capitalists and against capitalists, have been at the forefront and indeed organizers and leaders of these social movements. And unless we can have that happen, I don't think we'll advance very far. I think the Democrats and other capitalist parties will give us a little rope and allow a few reforms, and then they will quickly rope things in, to mix metaphors, and put in circumstances and processes within the movement of the left that brings people and their views back towards the Democratic Party. And I think, honestly, I hate to say it, but I think we've seen this in the DSA. Back in about 2016, there were these arguments about the dirty break and the necessity of using the Democratic Party as only a ballot line, but running, socialists and having them be independent and having them maybe even follow the discipline of the Democratic Socialists of America. And since then, I see that the DSA has moved to the right in a way that many of the people who advocated those ideas, including at the Jacobin magazine, have sort of, gone over to looking for ways that the Democrats can win in general and supporting the Democratic Party as such, and sort of tying their view of the future progress of the socialist movement to the future progress of the Democratic Party. And if that continues, as people, unify their view of interests with the Democrats, they move further and further to the right. And this is the reason I bring this up is because it's not the first time it's happened. And it's not good to lose a generation to the Democratic Party as it's happened in the past. Let me put it that way. Jay, you're muted.
We're coming to the last 15 minutes, right? I just unmuted myself. So we're coming to the last 15 minutes. Let's do a quick round. We've got Dave, Peter, and Shirley, and then we'll go back to the panelists and wrap it up.
Can I pose a quick question to Eric on the queue?
Sure.
Should I do that now?
You go ahead and do it.
So Eric, I really like this idea of withdrawing financial support from corporations and from banks and gaining control of their assets and crashing the markets and all that kind of thing. That sounds wonderful. Not to be glib, but I think it's pretty clear that that kind of economic dislocation would be basically equivalent to the hyperinflation in Germany in 1923. The savings that the whole middle class and upper middle class believe that they have, pension funds, housing values, all these things would collapse to almost nothing. The corporations, the capitalists would refuse to cooperate with the nationalization that was implemented in this scenario. There'd be lockouts. Someone would have to come in and break those lockouts, which would presumably be the unions, but the unions are collaborators, or the union bureaucrats at least cause the unions to collaborate with the Democratic Party. You can imagine where I'm going with this. I'm not sure exactly what would happen to production. If we could organize production, that'd be wonderful at that point. But I think I don't know. As much as I'd like to propagandize this scenario, I think there has to be a way to propagandize it that takes into account the fact that it virtually amounts to either needing to seize power, or having capitalists organize fascist gangs to undo whatever we would have accomplished at that point. So I'll put it that way.
Okay, but Eric, before you respond, Day has not had a chance.
Oh, sure.
To speak. So Day,
yeah.
could you go?
Okay, yeah. I'll address Eric Van de Venter. I really liked your presentation. A lot of interesting points. You mentioned diverting production of weapons and also interesting that there's so much unproductive labor, because I think it's not just about low wages, but it's also about what capitalist labor really provides for people and how ridiculous a lot of it is, like all the advertisements and et cetera. I agreed with most of the points, really. But the thing that I think that a lot of professors are missing today is that, Eric, you also mentioned crossing borders freely. The vaccine passports are preventing that. And I think that what a lot of professors are missing today is that there's a global infrastructure being put into place right now by the global elite. And they're censoring all of this information. For example, YouTube and Google have invested into AstraZeneca. And Operation Warp Speed, for example, was put into place by, supposedly by Trump, but it was the military distributing all these vaccines. And we know from history that these vaccines, the military has experimented on people using vaccine technology. And this technology is particularly revolutionary in the mRNA. I think it's very dangerous. So I think that this whole socialist program is not going to go anywhere if this enormous takeover of the economy and the physical sovereignty of people is not addressed. So, I mean, I just was talking to Eric because I really liked your presentation, but anyone could respond.
So, Day, was that the Eric Lerner or Eric Van de Venter?
Van de Venter.
Oh, okay. All right. So Peter and then Shirley, and then we're going to go back and wrap it up.
Yes. Eric Lerner mentioned eminent domain and taking over hotels. but I think Eric must know that the US Constitution, Fifth Amendment, allows for eminent domain. Every state in the Union has an eminent domain clause within their constitution. So instead of worrying about a hotel, we should realize that blue municipalities, let's say Boston, Seattle, Austin, Jackson, many, many cities, San Francisco, that has a working class based council, city council, or mayors could use eminent domain to take over factories based on the Constitution, that they want to maintain employment and they want to maintain salaries. They want to maintain budgets to run the state. You can't run the state unless workers are working and paying taxes. So eminent domain has been used in New London. It's been used in Hawaii. It's been used in Washington, D.C. to take over a part of Northwest D.C. So I really think that things you mentioned, Eric, about delegate democratic control. Worker cooperatives are the best example, far beyond unions, in terms of delegate democratic control. And if we could develop little Soviets of worker cooperatives within municipals and blue states, we could begin a movement that's based on the real lives of workers, based on productivity and democracy within these cooperatives.
Thank you, Peter. And Shirley, just a quick question, and then because we're really running out of time.
Yeah, I know. And I just want to thank the panelists for answering my question, even though it's out of your field of expertise. I really appreciate it. And you've given me much food for thought. Thank you so much.
Okay, stay in touch. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So Eric, a lot was directed to you.
I'll go quickly. In response to Dave's question, so yes, I understand there are many reasons to be skeptical and doubtful of the operations of the biomedical companies and the Defense Department and so forth. And I certainly think that I would say, at least from what I've heard about the the gain of function research that may have contributed, or at least had the potential to contribute, whether it in fact was the source of COVID-19, was very, very problematic and dangerous. I would come down very much on the side that taking the vaccine is a very important thing to reducing your chance of dying, having serious illness, or being carrying and transmitting the virus. But beyond that, I think your point is well taken, that the state has had sort of opportunities to increase its power over citizens, to use the bourgeois ideology, in ways that will be problematic for workers, not necessarily directly connected to biomedical oversight and so forth, but in many ways. I look at what's going on in Australia with the controls over movement, and my opinion would be that it's not warranted by the level of danger of the virus, and it is also has other dangerous potentials. So as far as an objection to the idea of open borders, perhaps, I don't know. I mean, I can imagine that there will be all kinds of problems with migration, and there will be all kinds of needs of people to migrate. And when people need to migrate, they will find ways to do it, and often they will do so in dangerous circumstances, and they may be subjected to state violence when they attempt to do it. And that will be extremely troubling. But I think we need to side with the right of people to move and the need of people to move. It's not no,
I wasn't objecting. Sorry, I wasn't objecting border crossing. I was saying particularly that anyone who doesn't have a vaccine or who doesn't want to be tested cannot cross borders anymore. So it's becoming unavailable to half the population or less, maybe. I mean, if you just want to get a test, but I'm just talking about the control that's coming from above. And also in 2023, you can't even fly to another state without a passport now. So it just seems like on so many levels, this is happening.
Right. Well, I mean, the concern is very real. And I don't know. We'll have to watch that very carefully as it unfolds, because I don't think it'll be confined to any particular medical necessity in the end. So I'll say that.
I just have another perspective on this, if you don't mind. I mean, it might seem very extreme hearing your conversation, if you don't mind. And that is that, I mean, we have all kinds of rules, that society introduces, and people are fine with that. I mean, I think this whole thing about vaccine, it is saving lives, wherever people are taking it. So even to insist that, you have to take it, of all the things, I would say, that's one, I don't necessarily oppose. There are lots of other rules, I would say the society that I came from, the society that I live in, where I would say, they're very problematic. And I don't see, people raising their voices on that. But this about vaccines, I mean, yeah, well, why aren't the people vaccinated? That's the whole thing. Is everything like a postmodern choice now? I don't feel like getting vaccinated. I don't believe in vaccines. I mean, come on, I don't feel like driving on the left side. I want to drive on the right side. Come on, let's stay with that. So I'm not into that, this kind of postmodern stuff. You have some things, vaccine. We got polio vaccines, right? As children, I'm sure probably you did too. And they were, first of all, they came free. And the entire country was vaccinated. Nobody was asking questions. That do you want to get vaccinated? Do you not want to get? The government said everybody gets vaccinated. We have to eradicate polio, and it was eradicated. That's what happened, and Sally's not here. I mean, look at these, socialist states. They go and vaccinate everybody, and, they reduce the number of people who have these, whatever, stuff coming up. And, we're kind of leaving it like this is debatable, like everything else. Is there climate problem happening? It's debatable. Vaccine, it's debatable, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm sorry, it might be a very unpopular opinion here, but I really don't. It's not? No?
No, I endorse you 100%. We did discuss this in the last teach-in.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was not there. But I mean, I'm really not into this, man. I mean, it's making me pretty crazy. What is this nonsense going on? Of all the things that people want to decide and have a choice on, vaccines, whether you want to save your life or not. And here I would say, this is the one good thing. I mean, I'm not into Biden or any of these guys, but he said vaccines, and we are giving it for free. And I'm saying, what is the problem now? Oh no, we are not into vaccine. This is just, that is what I call degeneration of a society. That to me is a sign of degeneration. Absolutely. That the one thing, that society is telling you, I'm saying the government, I'm calling society, is saying, this is on us and this will save lives. No, we don't want to do it. Okay, I'm done ranting for today.
Thanks, Topeka. Very good. So Eric Lerner, why don't you close it out for us?
Yes, please.
All right. Well, listen, I just endorse what Topeka said 100%, and we did discuss this at length in the last one. What we're talking about, obviously, is part of what we're talking about is socialist program, where we want to go. And when I was talking about the fact that the government could essentially nationalize the entire economy at the corporate level, at the large corporation level, I mean, your mom and pop store wouldn't care because they've never floated a corporate bond, I assure you. But what I'm saying that is being part of socialist program, of course, we would explain it that it could only be implemented when a movement puts in place a democratic mass society that can take over and run immediately these nationalized organizations. This would come out of a mass movement in which you have strike committees in banks, in financial institutions, and there were strikes in banks in the 1930s, you know, in factories and office places, so that once the United States government became the legal owner, the democratic way of running it would already be in place. So certainly these demands are part of a guidance of what a mass movement can do. And that's what we're really talking about. The dialectical relationship between a program that says, this is what socialism needs to do in order to really save humanity from a dark age. And this is how to grow rapidly a mass democratic movement that can take control of society and carry out this program, in the process of which the capitalist capital will disappear.
Okay, so we're gonna end it there, but Eric, you had a song that we.
Well, I mean, we can do this democratically. Are people interested in singing the last two verses of Solidarity Forever?
Yeah.
I don't want to impose this, but.
I don't mind, I'll watch, yeah.
What?
I don't know the song, so I'll watch.
Oh, it will be projected on the screen.
Okay.
All right, here.
International.
We'll give it a try.
No, that's something else.
Just a second. Does anybody know this song? If I'm the only one singing, it's going to sound terrible and people will not like it.
We'll all help out. We'll.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. 1, 2.
The tune of Battle Hymn of the Republic, right?
Oh, the tune, if people know the Battle Hymn of the Republic, hallelujah, you know, glory, glory, hallelujah. This is the same tune. They have taken untold millions. They never toiled to earn,
But without
our
the
brain and muscle,
not a single
wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.
For the union makes us strong.
Second verse, and by the way, the union referred to historically is not our union, but the union of all working people worldwide. This is from the International Workers of the World. So final verse, let's give it a try. Whoops. Oh.
No, we need it. I don't know the word.
There we go. You see it now?
Yeah.
In our hands.
In our
Hands
in our hands is
Oh.
placed a power greater than their mortal, greater than
the
magnified we can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of old. For the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.
Thank you.
We'll have to do the electronic synchronization better next time. I think we all agree with the sentiments.
Of course.
Posted video. Okay.
Okay, have a good break, everyone. We'll be back sometime in January for the
Thank
fourth
you. Take
installment.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Hope to see everybody
care.
back.
All right, thank you all.